My Gavanen Melunin, and well met indeed. I'm Arche Galadirthin, the head of the submod for the Third Age Total War Divide and Conquer, and here with the second instalment of the little series I was going to do on teaching you all about the background behind the factions that you play in DAC, Third Age Total War, and any Lord of the Rings game. So I've already done the Lost Realm of Arnor, and today I hope to do the first half of the history of the Kingdom of Gondor, with the history of their kings. Gondor's history is split quite nicely between the line of kings and then the time of the Stewards. Now, please leave as much feedback as you can. This time, I've incorporated more screenshots from the actual game, so you get an idea of that. I will still just use the screenshot slideshow thing for now, but as you'll see, there's far more pictures to illustrate what I'm talking about, and I have included the much requested family trees, and that features quite a few times throughout, so you'll be able to get a good idea of what I'm talking about and who I'm talking about. Although, side note, some of the kings don't have the correct accents over some of their letters because I forgot to do that, but that is a minor point because many of you probably don't even know how to write an accented letter, so you can search for it without the accents on the internet if you want to learn about a specific king. But let's dive right in. So there's a little screenshot of Gondor for you. I'm uncertain as to who created that. An interesting note that I will just mention here, which is entirely unrelated to the chronology at all, but many of you will notice that that's a picture of Minas Tirith, and the lower wall is black, solid black. Now that is actually lore accurate. In the film, Peter Jackson decided to make every building and every wall white for uniformity, or for whatever reason he chose. Whereas in truth, the lower wall was built of the same material that Orthanc is built from, and is said to be completely impenetrable. Nothing could break down that wall, be it siege equipment, be it Grond itself. Grond could get through the gates, but the walls never fell. So there's a little side bit about Minas Tirith for you. But the history of Gondor begins, much like Arnor's, with the downfall of Numenor. But Gondor is far more populated before Numenor falls, and this is particularly prevalent with towns like Pelagia, for example. In the Second Age 2350, so a full 1,000 years before the downfall of Numenor, Pelagia is founded in southern Gondor. It's on the banks of the River Anduin, on the northern banks, and it is a great haven in Gondor, one of their greatest in fact. Sometime before this as well, Londare is formed up in the not far north, but in the centre of Middle-earth in Enedwaith. I'll talk about that in a different video. But Pelagia is founded 2350 of the Second Age. It is also founded after Umbar, or around about the same time as Umbar. It's not really clear when Umbar is founded, but Umbar and Pelagia are far older than any of the key cities of Gondor that you will know. But then 1,000 years passes, Numenor goes on as it goes on, and then in the year 3320 of the Second Age, at the downfall of Numenor, the faithful set out from the port of Andúni, and they follow Elendil to the lands of Gondor and Arnor, as I said in the last video. Now Gondor, as I've already said, means rock land or land of stone. Arnor meant King's Land. However, the Númenóreans had already populated Gondor quite a bit throughout their history, so Gondor had a larger starting population than Arnor when the two nations arrived. Additionally, Gondor was said to be far more fertile and a much warmer and essentially happier climate. So there are quite a few more indigenous peoples who lived in Gondor, quite a few more non-Númenóreans. So when Elendil escaped Numenor with the faithful, it was far easier to integrate into the society of Gondor, and thus many of the Númenóreans who escaped went to Gondor, which is why Gondor becomes far more populated early on and builds up quicker. But this is what they come across in Gondor. This is where they settle. They land in, I believe, Pelagia, and then they begin building the regions and towns that we all know. So at the time that Gondor itself is founded, they also build, Minas Anor, which means the Tower of the Sun, which is Minas Tirith down in the corner just here. They also build Osgiliath, which means City of the Stars, essentially, or Fortress of the Stars, that sort of thing. They also build Minas Ithil. This is all in 3320, so this is long before the Last Alliance. Minas Ithil means Moon Tower, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And these are all built in this time. Now they bring with them to Gondor 3 Palantir, and they are housed in the 3 key cities, Osgiliath, Minas Ithil, and Minas Anor. Unfortunately, however, at almost the exact time that the forces of Gondor and Arnor arrive, Sauron, who they didn't realise escaped the downfall of Numenor, he sets up in Mordor and he immediately begins attacks on Gondor. Indeed, he begins attacks so much so that Minas Ithil is essentially destroyed. Well, not destroyed, but Minas Ithil is captured by the forces of Sauron. And the White Tree, which was initially set up in Minas Ithil, has to be moved to Osgiliath, where it is then housed for quite a considerable amount of time. But, seeing that Sauron has begun these attacks and he's relentless in his onslaught, Isildur heads north to counsel his father and the elves in the north, while Anarion, the king in southern Gondor, the king in Gondor, Isildur's brother, he retains control of Gondor and he continues to head off against Sauron. And he defends Gondor while Isildur is in the north. And this is all. And then the last alliance essentially culminates from this. Isildur gathers troops from the north, and they come south, and then together with forces from Lorinand, which is Lothlorien, Mirkwood, Moria, the Elves of Lindon, and the forces of Arnor, the last alliance takes place, and they defeat Sauron in 3441, which is also the final year of the Second Age. So 120 years after Gondor is founded, Sauron falls, and a period of peace can begin. Now, the reason I've got this picture is because little known to really anyone is that, hopefully you can see my mouse, is that obviously Elendil is killed in the Battle of the Last Alliance, and his body is taken to the hill of Aelinar, which is immediately renamed to Amon Anwar, which means Hill of Awe, upon Elendil's bury there. But it's said to be a secret location, and only Isildur, and a few select council members of Gondor know where this hill is. But for those of you who don't know, the hill is located around here, on where the mouth of, I think that's called the, I can't remember. That's despicable. The river here passes beneath the foot of essentially beneath the foot of the hill that Elendil is buried in. So rather than Elendil being buried in a great tomb in Minas Tirith, or Minas Anor at the time, or Osgiliath, or Minas Ithil, or any of the regions of Gondor, he is buried far on top of a single solitary hill that juts out from the mountains around this location. But only a few people know that he is buried there. Now, the hill becomes very important to the peoples of both Rohan and Gondor in about 2,500 years. But for all that time, Elendil lays hidden and no one really knows where he is. Obviously, Anarion is also killed at the Battle of the Last Alliance, and Isildur heads north, and we all know what happens to Isildur. His story is told in the Lost Realm of Arnor video, and Anarion's youngest son becomes king. Now, his name is Meneldyl, and he becomes the king. He rules for 156 years, which is a pretty long stint of time. But nothing particularly happens in Gondor now for quite some time. So here's the first little look at the family tree that I've done for you. So as I say, Isildur and Anarion rule jointly together for the first 120 years in the Second Age. Then Isildur rules on his own for a few years in the Third Age until his death, when Meneldyl becomes the sole king of Gondor. And he rules for 156 years, as I say. But then nothing happens in Gondor's history of note for 490 years. There is 490 years of just construction, consolidation, expansion, and general city building, essentially. And not until the days of King Tadastar, who you will see is all the way down here. This is the first king of real note in the history. All of these are just footnotes. They do the odd little bit here and there, but none of them really do anything major until Tadastar. Now, just a brief point about this picture. If it says B. that means he was born Tadastar, but this is his regal name. So he was born Tadastar, but he took the name Romendakil, which means East Victor, because in 492 of the Third Age, King Tadastar defeats a force of the Easterlings. He changes his name to Romendakil, but he is also unfortunately slain fighting the Easterlings still more. So he wins this great victory against the Easterlings, but then he is eventually killed fighting the Easterlings anyway. And that's all that really happens in the first 500 years of Gondor's founding. And then there is again a large period of peace after Romendakil. and nothing really happens again for another 400 years, until the year Third Age 840. And in the year Third Age 840 is the start of Gondor's rise to glory. So Tarastar Remendakil here, he defeated the Eastlings. Then Turumbar, Atanatar and Siriandil, nothing particularly happens until we arrive at Taran and Falastur. And as you can see from the picture here, he's called the First Ship King. Now the period between the First Ship King and the Fourth Ship King is essentially the period of Gondor's power. But Taran and Falastur is also famous for doing something quite different to just being the first of these four kings of real power. So he extends Gondor's borders to the west and to the south. But he's also very famous for marrying this woman. And she is mentioned by Aragorn in the books, and some of you may know her, and she's called Queen Beruthiel. Now, she was a dark Númenorian, a black Númenorian from Umbar. And it is uncertain as to why Taranon actually married her. But her name means Angry Queen, which gives you an idea of what she's like. And she was said to be completely loveless. She was cold, she was unfeeling, and she was horrid. She bore no children with Taran and Falastur, so the next king was actually his nephew. But Beruthiel was so hated and so horrible that by the end, before Taranon actually died, he essentially banished her. He popped her on a ship, and he just he sailed her off to far beyond Umbar. And the last thing that was known of her was she was sailing beyond Umbar to the lands to the far south, which are sort of suggested to be where more black Númenorians live. But she's also quite famous because she had 10 cats, 9 black cats and a single white cat. And through some sort of odd power that I don't quite understand, she used these cats to spy on the other noblemen and the people of Gondor, and she gained this horrid reputation. But she used the white cat to spy on the black cats, so that she had this full network of spies going. But anyway, she was hated, and she bore no children. So the second Ship King, who is called Eärnil, he was the nephew of Taran and Falastur, not his son. Shortly after Taran and Falastur's death, though, Umbar actually continued their attacks on Gondor, because it's important to note that while I've said nothing's really happened for this 840 years of Gondor's founding, they have always been at war with Umbar during this time. They've always had minor skirmishes, minor ship battles, nothing of any note, but there's always been battles. But then in the reign of the second Ship King, Eärnil, and in the year 933, so about 1,000 years after Gondor's founding, Eärnil captures Umbar. He captures it in a great siege, and he doesn't destroy the city because the city continues ever on, but he captures the city and he claims a great victory for Gondor. However, he is then lost at sea in a great storm and is killed. So his reign is abruptly ended after capturing this glorious victory over Umbar. He then is killed by the nature itself. And his son then becomes king, King Ciriandil. And he is the third Ship King. And his very unfortunate reign is marked by a constant defense of Umbar. So throughout this time, and this is, as I say, about 1,100 years into Gondor's history, the entire sort of force of the country is dedicated toward defending Umbar. And Ciriandil even gives his life defending Umbar. In the year 1015, he is slain defending Umbar from a large siege. Mostly because when Eärnil captured Umbar, many of the Dark Númenorians fled into what is Horondor, which is the land to the east and north of Umbar. And they rallied the forces of the Haradrim, and they lay siege to Umbar for around about 30 years. But because Umbar was so well supported by sea with these Ship Kings, their name does have a reason. Umbar never fell, and the attackers couldn't starve them out, and they couldn't take it by force of arms. But Ciriandil is slain defending Umbar. And then his son, the fourth and final Ship King, he destroys the forces of Harad. Here's Horondor, as I said, just north and east of the region of Umbar. The fourth Ship King is called Ciriahir, and he claims Umbar back completely. He defeats and destroys the Haradrim, so much so that he takes the name Hiarmendakil, which means Southern Victor. Now he's Hiarmendakil the First. There's another one a little later on. But he takes the name Southern Victor. And Hiarmendakil the First, in the years 1050 to 1149. So we're about 1,200 to 1,300 years into Gondor's founding. That is Gondor's heyday. This is its height of power. It lasts for around about 200-300 years, give or take, but the map shown here shows you Gondor at the full extent of its power. So this is in Hiarmendakil's reign. Thanks to the efforts of Remendakil, Run has been subdued and they own all this land here. Whilst this land does say that it's all part of Gondor, it is sort of really vassal states, because obviously the Druidine and the Pukel men do live around the tips around here, and Gondor doesn't really populate this area. Enedwaith still has some indigenous peoples, but is largely held by Gondor. And Umbar itself is held by Gondor, but they do only have a loose hold over the Haradrim principalities. So that's why this area is that sort of checkered lines. But that's Gondor at the absolute peak of its power. And as I say, it lasts for about 200-300 years. But it almost immediately begins declining after its power. So the fourth ship king was Hiarmendakil here, born Kirya here. And then his son, Atanatar II Alcarin, this is the first Atanatar. Atanatar II, he is incredibly lazy, and he gets really complacent with Gondor's power, and it sets in motion the abilities of Gondor's enemies to gain strength against the might that is Gondor. And Atanatar's reign is nothing really happens in Atanatar's reign. He's just, as I say, he's lazy, and enemies start to gain power, and they start to see that Gondor is complacent. And then Atanatar's son, Narmakil, he doesn't really have any desire to rule. None really whatsoever. Excuse me, sorry. But he sees that his nephew, Minalcar, who is 2 below him in the list, see just here, he sees that Minalcar is really, the word that is used to describe him is vigorous. Minalcar is really ambitious, and he's very talented as a ruler. So within 14 years of Narmakil ruling, he elects Minalcar as the Prince Regent. And this essentially means that Minalcar just rules. He's sort of the de jure king, or whilst Narmakil is the de facto king. Or possibly the other way around. I can never remember. One means legal and one means fact, and I can't remember which one relates this time. So Narmakil actually is the king, but Minalcar does all the ruling. And Minalcar becomes the Prince Regent in 1240. So we're still in the peak of Gondor's sort of power stage, but as I said, the enemies were getting stronger with the complacency of Atanatar's rule, and Minalcar is forced to defend Gondor again from the Easterlings in 1248. So 8 years after he becomes Prince Regent, he marches out against the forces of the Easterlings, and he completely obliterates them. So much so that he again takes the title Remendakil when he eventually becomes king, in about 60 years. But at the moment he's still Prince Regent, so whilst he's Prince Regent, he defeats the Eastlings in this climactic battle, and he absolutely decimates them in 1248. But something that he also does, aside from being this incredible ruler, he also lacks a little bit of foresight, unfortunately. Because Minalcar, in the year 1250, sends his son, Valakar, this gentleman just here, he sends Valakar north. Sorry, I've missed a picture. This is the area where Minalcar destroys the Easterlings. So it's not a battle down here near the borders of Gondor. It's right in the Easterlings' home. It's right in their territory. They're even said to have sacked some lands beyond the Sea of Run. So this is a time where wars are won in big key battles. They're not ongoing skirmishes for indefinitely. They're big, very massive battles, and they'll decide the entire fate of this whole region, which it does. Minalcar's defeat ensures Run stays loyal for a lot longer. But, as I say, 2 years later, he sends his son north to meet with this gentleman. This is Prince Videgavia, the first named ruler of the Kingdom of Rovanion. And Videgavia, Minalcar, or Remendakil, we'll call him Remendakil, he sends his son north to liaise with the Northmen. He tries to set up a peace with them. He tries to set up an agreement with them. He wants to ally the two kingdoms together, basically. So he sends his son north as an emissary to get on with them. But what he doesn't anticipate is that his son, Valakar, he falls in love with and marries this daughter of Videgavia. She's called Vidamavi, and he marries her. which doesn't cause any problems at the moment. But 10 years later, in 1260, Remendikil calls Valacar back. He has done his mission and he calls him back. And Valacar brings with him his wife and quite a few nobles from the upper echelons of command of the Vidigavian society. So this large family of Northmen come back to Gondor, and this immediately sets off trouble. People do not like it at all that a member of Gondor's royal line, people who live for about 250 years even now, has married one of these lesser humans who only lives for about 60 to 80 years. And he's tainted the royal blood by marrying this woman. And they're already annoyed. But Valacar has only just been recalled, nothing else has happened yet. But this is in 1260. Now, Minalcar is still only the regent at this time, because his father has since come to the throne, and continues to allow Minalcar to rule in his stead, because Narmakil had no children. And Minalcar's father's rule is nothing really happens in his father's rule. And in 1304, Minalcar himself is finally crowned and takes the name Remendikil properly. That's his full royal title, Remendikil. And that's in 1304. So 40 years after Valacar has returned from the north with his wife. And these Northmen have been around Gondor society for now 40 years. And it's only made things worse. But Minalcar does do something very key at this point. We're not entirely certain as to the year that he does this, but he builds the Argonath. There's suggestion that this is in 1340, some 40 years after the start of his reign, but there's also suggestion that he builds the Argonath almost immediately upon defeating the Easterlings. So it happens sometime between 1248 and 1340. So in that period of 100 years, well, 92, Remendikil builds the Argonath, or commissions the Argonath. The Argonath itself is a Sindarin word which means royal stones, with a plural ath at the end. And they are in the likeness of Isildur and Anarion. Isildur on the left and Anarion on the right-hand side. And this now marks the northern border of Gondor. So if you remember the map from a few moments before, where the northern border extended all the way to Mirkwood, in Gondor's height of power, by the time Remendikil comes to power, about 200 years, almost 200 years dead after the height of Gondor's power, the northern border has already retreated to the Argonath, the Nen Hithoel, which I believe is the name of the lake that resides in the Emyn Muil. So it's retreated quite a considerable way. They still hold sort of lordship over the lands north of it, but the peoples there will have declined in number with the fear and the proximity to the Easterlings. Right, so after a very eventful Prince Regency ship, if that's what you call it, Minalcar becomes king as Remendikil, and then nothing happens. When he's king, he has a really uneventful kingship, and there's peace in Gondor for the remainder of his reign. And then his son becomes king, and now the unrest is really kicking off, because Valacar has now had a son. I can't remember the birth date of Eldacar, but I believe Eldacar is actually born when he's still up in the north. But anyway, Valacar and Vidimarvi did have a son, and he's called Vinithaya. However, he changes his name to Eldacar when he arrives in Gondor, so he is born up in the north. So in the 10 years that Valacar is there, he marries the daughter of the king, and then he has a son with her. And Vinithaya comes back to Gondor with him. And now that Valacar is king, there's a very real threat that Vinithaya is going to become the king. And he's half Dunedain and half normal men, half Northmen, and the Gondorians hate this, especially the Gondorians who live in the southern fiefs. So Pelargir, the town of Pelargir, Lebanon, and Umbar, particularly in Horondor, the southern lands are all in uproar at this splitting of the blood. And toward the end of Valacar's reign, as it's becoming paramount, as it's becoming clear that he's soon to die and Eldacar is going to become the king, there is great unrest. So Valacar is king here after Remendikil, and then Vinithaya becomes Eldacar, and he becomes king in 1432. And if you read on a little bit here, you'll see that a mere 10 years later, or 5 years later, Castamir the Usurper becomes king, and that we will explain now. This is the first of Gondor's 3 main troubles, as they are highlighted. There are 3 things that really affect the decline of Gondor, and this is the first. And it's called the Kin-Strife. And quite simply, they're so outraged at the fact that a king has come to the throne who is half Northman and half Gondorian, that Castamir rallies the forces of the southern fiefs and he besieges Osgiliath. And he usurps the throne. And he actually does do this. So after 5 years of Eldacar being a king, Castamir manages to capture Osgiliath and defeat Eldacar in battle. Now Eldacar isn't killed and he escapes. He flees back to his parents. He flees back to his mother's homeland in the north, to Ravanion. However, his eldest son Ornendil is killed by Castamir. He's put to death. But unfortunately, through this siege of Osgiliath, the Palantir of Osgiliath is lost at this time. The White Tree still remains, but the Palantir is lost. So Osgiliath is captured by Castamir and he becomes king. Now he only rules for 10 years. And these 10 years are marked by abysmal rulership. Castamir hates the north so much that he tries to move his capital back down to Pelargir in the south. And he is an awful ruler. He just can't command the peoples at all, and it becomes very apparent that whilst they were displeased with a king who was half and half, they're even more displeased with Castamir because he has no ruling skill whatsoever. And so in 10 years after Castamir becomes king, Eldacar returns. And now the peoples are incensed because Castamir was a terrible ruler. So the northern fiefs, so Ithilien, Arnorian, Calanathan, and the lands sort of to the west, along with reinforcements brought from the Northmen, all form together to fight in this mighty army, and they take back Gondor from Castamir. Castamir is slain by Eldacar himself in retaliation for the loss of his son, and they push Castamir back to Pelargir, where they push Castamir's forces back to Pelargir, where they are besieged, and then they flee to Umbar. So all of Castamir's sons and his loyal followers flee to Umbar, where they are happily welcomed in. And this again separates Umbar from Gondor. So up until this point, we're now at around 1447 in the Third Age. Umbar has been essentially a loyal town and fiefdom of Gondor for quite some time, since Eärnil captured it in 933. So for about 500-600 years, Umbar has just been a nothing town, a part of Gondor. But now Umbar is forever separated from Gondor and never really fights with them ever again, because Castamir's sons and his loyal forces take Umbar. So they're all killed, and Eldacar defeats Castamir in a battle called the Battle of Erui, which I do have a picture of, because this is the river Erui, E-R-U-I. And Eldacar comes from the north with the forces from Anorian, which is this one just here, Calanathan, which soon becomes Rohan, and the northern fiefs and the western fiefs, and they form an army, and he brings men from the north, and they come down and they meet Castamir at the Battle of Erui, where Eldacar slays him. And then his sons are trapped in Pelargir and they flee to Umbar. And this ends the period known as the Kin-Strife. Castamir is defeated, the royal line is re-established, and Eldacar ends up living for 235 years or something like that. So it shows no signs that his blood was watered down whatsoever, much to the disdain of those who hated him. Now again, the next period of time is marked with not really very much happening. Now that Umbar is free again, essentially, is no longer with Gondor, it stirs up the forces of Harad, who have so far just been vassals of Gondor, and Aldemir, Eldacar's son, is slain defending Gondor from an army from Harad and Umbar. But in retaliation to that, his son Vinyarion responds almost immediately, and he defeats the Haradrim in a very major battle again in the lands of Horondor. And he takes the title Jarmendekil II, becoming the second Jarmendekil. So the second Jarmendekil, comes in. He is crowned, I believe, in 1551. Oh no, in 1551 he defeats the armies of the south. So about 600 years again after the last Jarmendekil, the second Jarmendekil comes in. But then again, there's a period of not very much happening, apart from one key feature, and another reason why Umbar and Gondor really can't stand each other. In the year 1634, so we're we're now getting on for 200 years after the events of the Kin-Strife. King Minardil, the son of Hiarmendikil, he visits Pelargir, thinking that there is no longer any problem. Pelargir has now for 200 years been part of standard Gondor again. There can't be that many issues. But the great-grandsons of Castamir learn that Minardil is going to Pelargir. And over these past 200 years, Umbar has been constantly raiding and harassing Gondor. They've never let them rest. And the two great-grandsons of Castamir, they rally a large force and they sail to Pelargir and they besiege it. And they kill Minardil while he is there. Now, the two great-grandsons are called Angamayate and Sanghayando. And they're the two great-grandsons. And I believe they escape. It doesn't say that they die. So they successfully raid and kill Minardil. They plunder Pelargir. They don't destroy it and they don't capture it, but they plunder it and they sail back to Umbar. It is also very worth noting that at this time, King Minardil elects a steward called Hurin of Emun Arnin. So we're in 1634, 1,600 years after Gondor's founding, there or thereabouts. Hurin of Emun Arnin is elected as steward by King Minardil, because in the time of the kings, each king elected their own steward. It wasn't passed to anyone. There was no set feature. The king chose his own steward. And Minardil chooses Hurin of Emun Arnin. And this starts off a chain whereby every future steward from here on out is of Hurin's bloodline. They're all from his family. So it's not hereditary at this time, but the next stewards are all chosen from Hurin's family. And I think it's because Hurin proves to be an incredibly wise and skilled steward. And he's of a royal bloodline. He has royal blood in him. He's related ever distant to one of... to possibly... he's royal bloodline, I recall. And all the stewards thereafter are chosen from his blood. But now the true events, the second event that really cripples Gondor then occurs. And this is the Great Plague. Now I spoke of this a great deal in the Northern video, in the Lost Realm of Arnor video, because it happens to them as well. But the Great Plague kills hundreds in Gondor, thousands. Whilst it only really affects its Cardlan and somewhat of the Shire in the north, in the Gondor it decimates Gondor. The entire royal family is killed. King Telumatar, I believe he's called. No, Telemnar, sorry. So King Telemnar is killed. He loses all of his sons. Thousands in Gondor are killed. Osgiliath is partially deserted. So many people are killed. The watch on Mordor ends. They cease watching Mordor. They've been watching Mordor now for 1,700 years, and now they stop. Or 1,600 years, sorry. And finally they now stop. And the White Tree finally withers in Osgiliath and is moved to Minas Anor by Torondor, who is the nephew of Telemnar, because Telemnar's whole family are killed, but his nephew survives, and Torondor becomes the next king, and he moves the White Tree to Minas Anor. So it isn't until 1636 that the White Tree takes up residence on the 7th level of Minas Tirith, and it still isn't even called Minas Tirith yet. And this is the third tree. I mean, Isildur brought the original tree from Númenor and set it in Minas Ithil. That one was destroyed. It then moved to Osgiliath, where it has now been withered by the plague, and it then moves to Minas Tirith, or Minas Anor, which is still called the Sun Tower. But, as I say, the Watch on Mordor now ends, and that proves to be very eventful for Gondor in future. Now the next king, after Torondor doesn't do too much other than try to rebuild Gondor in the wake of the Great Plague. But the next king, finally deciding that something needs to be done about Umbar with their constant raids and the slaying of Minardil some 200 years earlier. Telumatar, as I say, the next king, he builds an army and he goes and obliterates Umbar. He recaptures it for Gondor and he finally kills off any descendant of Castamir. So in 1810... Castamir's descendants are finally all killed. 400 years after Castamir's uprising, his family line has been annihilated. And Telumatar takes the epithet Umbardakil, which means Umbar Slayer or Umbar Defeater, Umbar Victor, that essential, those things. And he claims back Umbar. And then after the Great Plague has struck, they've already been through the Kin-Strife, they've reclaimed Umbar now, and then the third major problem for Gondor arrives in the shape of the Wainriders. Now I spoke briefly about the Wainriders in the Arnor video as well, but they have a much bigger impact in Gondor, as you might imagine. And in 1856, so 46 years after Tulumatar's great victory over Umbar, with Gondor finally rebuilding and working back after the plague, the Wainriders come out of the east. Now they are named for the great chariots that they use in battle, and they obliterate Gondor in a battle called the Battle of the Plains. Gondor and Rovanion fight this battle together jointly, and Gondor's king is slain in this battle. I believe it is Narmakil II, this gentleman just here. He is killed in this battle. And with a force of Gondor and the Northmen, the Wainriders obliterate this army, and they claim large swaths of land in northern Gondor. And this is in 1856. And at this time as well, Gondor's border now officially moves to the Anduin, so that all the land that they held between Gondor and Mirkwood and Gondor on the Sea of Run is now all lost, and their official barrier is now Anduin. So they've been heavily beaten back. But the Wainriders don't claim... They claim all of that land, but they don't invade Gondor anymore, because they also took a lot of losses. However, 40 years later, in 1899, the son of Narmakil II, King Kalametar, is warned by a prince of the Northmen called Marwini that the Wainriders are going to be coming again, and they're going to attack to try and claim Calanathan. They're going to cross over the River Anduin and move into Calanathan, which you will all know as Rohan, and many of you will know as Calanathan. So in the lands of Rohan are still at Gondorian at this time, and the Wainriders are planning to move in and take that. But Kalametar, with this knowledge that Marwini has given him, he uses this to his advantage, and he obliterates the Wainriders in battle. So after losing a substantial loss at the Battle of the Plains, the joint forces of Gondor and the Northmen then destroy the forces of the Wainriders, and in the lands of the Dagorlad. So Kalametar comes up from the south, and he begins his attack on the Wainriders, and it's sort of one-on-one. It's reasonably fair, but then Marwini launches a surprise attack with the Eothed, and he comes in from the side, and they completely obliterate the Wainriders in the lands, as I say, of the Dagorlad here. So 2,000-ish years after the Battle of the Last Alliance took place in this very spot, the Gondorians are again here fighting for their lands. And they defeat the Wainriders this time. They get complete victory over the Wainriders, thanks to the efforts of Marwini and Kalametar. However, this is not enough for the Wainriders, and 40 years later, after retreating back to Run and licking their wounds, they come at Gondor again, in the third time that the Wainriders attack Gondor. And this time it's up to King Ondahir of Gondor to deal with the problem. Now, Ondahir, as you may already know, in his reign, has already wed off his daughter to Arvedui from the north. After the 1,900 years of separation, Gondor and Arnor finally see to help each other. And now that you've heard the Lost Realm video and you've listened to this video, you can clearly see that Gondor has had no interaction with Arnor throughout the entire time, and Arnor had no interaction with Gondor throughout the whole time. So they are very separate realms at this time. And it is very worthwhile noting that the Gondorians really look down on the Kingdom of Arnor. They don't see it as worthy of Gondorian time or effort. And that heavily influences the decision to not let Arvedui rule both kingdoms, despite his legal claim. So Ondahir marries off his daughter Firiel to Arvedui in the north. But, as I said, 45 years after the initial defeat of the Wainriders come again, and Ondahir is slain in the disaster of the Morannon, which again takes place here. And this time, as I say, he is killed, and the Haradrim have attacked at the same time from the south, and Earnil, a descendant of Tulumatar Umbadakil from before, the king who defeated Umbar, his descendant Earnil wins a great victory in the south over the Haradrim and comes up on the Wainriders in the north, and he destroys them in a battle called the Battle of the Camp. He completely takes them by surprise, and he obliterates them. So much so the Wainriders are never seen or heard of again. And Earnil's victory, he gets elected king by Pelendur, the steward at the time. Now, as I said, the decision that they reach to choose Eärnil is because they don't see Arthedain as a kingdom worthy enough of sending a king to Gondor. Gondor is this great kingdom, and Arthedain is this tiny, minuscule kingdom. Like, to put it into perspective, the Gondorians would be the Italians viewing the tiny state of... oh, I've completely forgotten its name. That's a terrible, terrible analogy. San Marino. They consider... So the Gondorians would be Italy in that situation, and the tiny city-state of San Marino would be Arthedain. That's the sort of level they would look at them at, with them having this vast country and Arthedain having nothing. Why would Arthedain's king be good enough for Gondor? So Pelindur and the Council of Gondor elect Eärnil as the next king, because he's descended from a king 3 generations before. It's also worth noting that Pelindur is the steward who now makes the stewardship hereditary. So after Pelindur, he makes it so that the next steward will always be the descendant of the steward before. And that continues on, and it's quite lucky that he does that, because after Eärnil's victory in the Battle of the Camp, he sends Eärnil north, as we all know, in 1975, 30-ish years later. He sends his son north to help Arnor, and he defeats the Witch King there, as explained in the Lost Realm video. And Eärnil comes back, and upon the death of his father, he becomes king. But in the year 2002, the Witch King returns to the south after his defeat in the north, and he claims Minas Ithil for good. Its name becomes Minas Morgul, and it never again is ruled by Gondorians until Aragorn takes up ownership. At this same time, in 2002, Minas Tirith finally becomes Minas Tirith, with the loss of Minas Ithil and that becoming a Mordor city. Minas Anor is renamed Minas Tirith because it then becomes the Tower of Guard, the City of Guard. Now, Eärnil rules for only 7 years, because the disgrace that he felt at the hands of the Witch King in the north finally comes to fruition in the south, and the Witch King challenges Eärnil to one-on-one combat in Minas Morgul, and Eärnil agrees, and he rides out to see the Witch King with a small retinue of knights, and he is never seen again. Now, as many of you pointed out in the last video, there is no definitive answer that he was actually killed. It is heavily suggested that he may have been tainted by the Witch King to become a servant. But Eärnil becomes the last king of Gondor. And the stewards then take up rulership, and they take the steward's oath, which is essentially, we shall rule in the name of the king until the king returns. And this is the reason that they do this, and there isn't again a new king elected, is because there's a reasonable belief that Eärnil isn't actually dead, so no one wants to react yet till they find out what happens. And secondly, everyone is even though the Kin-Strife was now about 600 years ago, everyone still remembers it quite vividly, because remember, people in Gondor at this time are still living for 200 plus years. So it's only 3 generations ago. And it's sort of a similar thing to people nowadays remembering their ancestors fighting in the First World War. It'd be that sort of time scale. So they remember it really vividly, and they don't want a second civil war. So nobody stakes a claim to the throne for fear of that second civil war, even though there are people who could legitimately rule. So instead, Mardil Voronwë becomes the first ruling steward of Gondor. And then after him come the time of the stewards, which I shall explain in a second video. And that brings about the end of Gondor's history through the time of the kings. So, thank you very much for watching it, if indeed you have. Please leave as much feedback as you wish. I'd love to know what you all think about it, what you all thought of the family tree, a few pictures of the game, or if you would rather just see pure campaign map while I speak. I will talk about the fiefdoms of Gondor, but that will be a separate video. So at the minute, obviously, I've not told you anything about Dol Amroth, which I could talk about at length. I've not told you anything about Lebenin, Anfalas, Pinnath Gelin, anything like that. I'll talk about all those in a separate video. This one's already 45 minutes in length. And I'll talk about the stewards in the next video. So there'll be 2 more Gondor videos to come, and then we move on to either the elves or the dwarves, I would think. But for now, as ever, as I say, thank you very much for watching, if indeed you have. I'm Arakair Galadirthin, the head of Divide and Conquer. Please feel free to write any comments you wish, and until we speak again, dear friends, Navar Naden Pedimad Melunin, and farewell.